Hello, welcome to my next presentation. Intermedialism versus agnosticism. CANI'S complex plane of religiosity versus Dawkins' linear scale of religiosity. After 150 years, religious agnosticism to the being, time for new definition. Before comparing the Dawkins linear scale of religiosity based on Huxley's agnosticism with Kani's complex plane of religiosity, we should first ask the fundamental question: is Huxley's religious agnosticism correctly defined and applied? To answer this question correctly, we should first consider the term agnosticism in the context of the meaning of the word existence, the application of the word existence to imaginary, in other words, delusional beings, or only the real ones, and definition of agnosticism in comparison with Kani's intermedialism. In the context of the word existence, to better understand it, let's ask the question: does the God exist? Atheists will answer, no, God does not exist. Theists will certainly state, yes, God exists. Huxley's agnostics will not either confirm or deny the existence of God, answering directly, I don't know, because I have no knowledge. But does this question make any sense? There is only one answer. The question asked is senseless, inter alia, because there are no real and true attributes of God. We don't know who we are asking about, so we don't know who or what God is and what his physical parameters are, which would allow to formulate an ambiguous definition of God, consistent with the essence of the real physical world. In consequence, the definition of the word God is devoid of meaning attributes, which classifies this definition into the category of pseudo-definitions found in myths and fairy stories. It is therefore senseless to raise the question of God's existence. Moreover, being confident that we know who is the God we are asking about, we are assuming a false premise, thus committing a material fallacy, because we should first have to define the concept of God on the basis of the real true attributes and then ask the question about the God's existence. All this doesn't prevent any God from existing in myths and not existing in the reality at the same time, because the word existence is not a real predicate, thus it cannot be an essential, uniquely determined property of anything. Now let's consider the term of agnosticism coined by Huxley in 1869, according to which, generally speaking, we cannot state with certainty the falsehood or truthfulness of some judgments, and with this we can agree, but only in relation to the real beings, not the delusional ones. It is generally known that none of us has the knowledge to fully understand the reality. On the other hand, the essence of nature constitutes itself an impassable barrier that prevents us from knowing it deeper. Cognizing the reality, however, differs from cognizing the imaginary events and beings, just as facts and science differ from miracles and religious myths, which results from the Kani's law of value of independent beings based on the laws of nature. Huxley simply confused the concepts that require diametrically opposed methods of cognition because of the nature of the things they refer to. After all, the reality is cognized by experience and reason, which makes it possible to explore reality more and more deeply, whereas the religious reality is cognized by the faith, based more on non-rational than irrational perception of the world, and therefore has no cognitive value. Huxley, by defining religious agnosticism, syncretized science with theology. In other words, Huxley has equated fiction with reality, what the scientist should not do. As insightful as Huxley was about the science and religion, his definition of agnosticism cannot pass muster as correct definition based on rational argumentation, in other words, argumentum ad rem. So religious agnosticism deserves only to be trashed. The argumentation ad rem concerning the existence or non-existence of God discredits the substantive value of religious agnosticism. Agnosticism based on such non-rational grounds is senseless and proves intellectual inertia and lack of willingness to understand things. Above all, agnosticism robs people of courage to adopt the clear-cut position to the root of the matter, referring to the existence or non-existence of God. On the other hand, in the context of the real beings, such as nature, agnosticism is the most appropriate term corresponding to the essence of nature and the human's cognitive abilities, and only to this extent the term agnosticism makes sense, which imposes the necessity to clarify this term. Thus is Huxley's definition of agnosticism abstaining from opinion due to the lack of sufficient rational grounds to confirm or to deny the existence of God correct just because it has many followers, among whom there are even well-known scientists such as Russell, agnostic for a philosophical audience, atheist for the ordinary man; Gould, unbelieving agnostic, claiming I am not a believer, I am an agnostic; Dawkins, counting himself as agnostic in category 6 but leaning towards 7, known for the agnostic statement God almost certainly doesn't exist; Hartmann, a Krakowian philosopher, honest agnostic with no pride, who says that agnosticism is an attitude of intellectual honesty. An agnostic says if God existed, he would expect me to be an agnostic because I really don't know. It is arrogance to pretend to know something you don't know. Every common-sense person, especially academic, when asked about the real, physical existence of God, should answer in the way proposed by Professor Barbara Stanusz. This question makes no sense, or I have no idea what the question is about, but in no case I don't know, which is typical of almost certainly agnostics, such as, for example, Richard Dawkins, who is paradoxically considered by some to be the king of the atheists or the pope of the atheists, what borders on paranoia. But why would atheists need the king or the pope, who in addition is an agnostic? Another idol to admire? It is nothing more than vanity founded on the prevailing view to adulate authorities promoted by media. Well, the masses have always needed the all-knowing prophets, even if it made them look ridiculous. Infatuation with Dawkins is a classic case of emotivistic behavior of his followers, in which irrationalism and emotion prevail over the objective assessment of the expressed views. But is it appropriate for scientists, nota bene from the world-famous universities, to declare themselves religious agnostics? In the context of the presented facts, argumentation discredits the substantive value of the religious agnosticism, and thus classifies the religious agnosticism as senseless, while in the case of agnosticism related to the real world, argumentation corresponds to the essence of the real world, in other words, nature and the human cognitive capabilities, and only to this extent agnosticism makes sense, which imposes the necessity to clarify this term and create new definitions as follows. In relation to the real beings, the following term shall be used: CANI'S real agnosticism, in short, vero agnost. This view expresses uncertainty as to the final knowledge of the physically existing beings. It results from the limitations imposed by the essence of the real world and the human cognitive capabilities, enabling to learn about the reality only to a limited extent. By identifying as vero-agnos, one expresses the view of limited knowledge of understanding the reality. This, however, does not result from the human knowledge, even it is very advanced, but from the limitations coming from the human mind and the nature itself. Therefore, classifying yourself as vero-agnos is the most appropriate, corresponding to the essence of things. In relation to the existence or non-existence of God, the following term shall be used: CANI'S intermedialism, in short, intermedialism. This view expresses uncertainty as to the existence or non-existence of God by a person who does not want or cannot reveal his atheistic worldview, or does not have the knowledge that would allow to draw the conclusive conclusions when choosing a worldview. Although considering yourself as an agnostic or an intermedialist is senseless, and many people may be aware of it, agnosticism as well as intermedialism protects against the social alienation and ostracism and allows to avoid labeling as an atheist, which even today happens to be wrongly connoted evil. And that is because today's society expects from us ignorance and conformity rather than expressing views consistent with knowledge and reason. Maybe therefore agnosticism is so popular and accepted, although it is senseless. However, we should realize the fact that the intermedialists, like the religious agnostics, expose themselves to ridicule and embarrassment when they present their religious views to the advanced scientific community that has the knowledge to distinguish fiction from the reality. So now we can make a comparison of CANI'S intermedialism with the Dawkins-Huxley-based religious agnosticism. Although CANI'S intermedialism and religious agnosticism are based on the same definition, that means a person cannot state with certainty the falsehood or truthfulness of some judgments referring to the existence or non-existence of gods, there is the fundamental difference between the two terms. CANI'S intermedialism does not stem from the lack of evidence concerning the existence of God, but due to the fear of ostracism or being criticized, potential aggressivity, antipathy from worldview opponents, the lack of knowledge that would enable you to distinguish fiction from reality, what Huxley as well as his followers have not mentioned when defining the religious agnosticism. Dawkins, following almost certainly Huxley reasoning, ultimately has come to a conclusion that God almost certainly doesn't exist. It is curious, but this agnostic view postulated by Dawkins is certainly based on a certainty concerning the uncertainty as to the existence of God. The difference between CANI'S intermedialism and Dawkins' agnosticism lies in the distinct interpretations, not only in reference to religiosity, but also to the graphical interpretation. CANI'S intermedialism is represented by the complex plane of intermedialism shown on the left side of this slide, while Dawkins' agnosticism is represented by a linear scale placed on the right side of this slide. The Dawkins linear scale of agnosticism ranges from the second category, which is very close to theism, up to the sixth category, which is very close to atheism. This scale of agnosticism is placed between two extremes of opposite certainty, that means number 1, marked in yellow in the scale, which presents strong theism pertaining to the absolute certainty as to the existence of God, and then number 7, marked in green in the scale, corresponding to strong atheism, that means absolute certainty about non-existence of God. Although this linear scale is extremely simple to understand, it is too abstract when it comes to its practical application. Regardless of the category proposed by Dawkins, an agnostic will always be an agnostic, unsure of the existence of God. So what is the sense of classifying agnostics from category 2 to 6 if each of them, regardless of the reason, doubts the existence and non-existence of God? Before considering the CANI'S complex plane of intermedialism, to make it more understandable, first let's consider the CANI'S complex plane of religiosity from theism through intermedialism to atheism. The degree of religiosity expressed by the complex number z is visualized and plotted in the CANI'S complex plane of religiosity. This plane is actually the Cartesian plane, formed by two axes which are in the right angle to each other. That means real horizontal axis, named RE marked in green in the graph, and the imaginary vertical axis, named IM marked in yellow in the graph. The real horizontal axis corresponds to 100% atheism, that means represents the absolute absence of the belief that any God exists, and the imaginary vertical axis refers to 100% theism, in other words, represents the absolute belief in the existence of a God or gods. The degree of religiosity is expressed by a complex number in the CANI'S complex plane, which is denoted as the unique point z, whose coordinates consist of the real part A and the imaginary part IB, and it is written as z equals to A plus IB, where I is called the imaginary unit, whose square is equal to -1. The degree of religiosity can also be denoted in polar form by the modulus, that means the length of the red arrow shown in the graph and the angle alpha between the red arrow and the real axis representing atheism. Since each imaginary event or being has an explanation in the real world, including as to the state of a person identifying imagination with reality, the CANI'S complex plane of religiosity can also be used to interpret the imagined beings or events represented by the imaginary axis of theism, IM, in terms of the rational arguments expressed by the real axis of atheism, RE. The CANI'S complex plane, on the contrary to Dawkins' linear scale, doesn't categorize the degree of religiosity. It allows only for visualization of possible degree of religiosity expressed by people. Accordingly to the situation, knowledge, or other conditions, people shape their religious views. In case of agnosticism or intermedialism, no matter what is the degree of religiosity, a person unsure of the existence of God will always remain agnostic or intermedialist. Having general knowledge about the CANI'S complex plane of religiosity, let's now consider its individual cases. That means the CANI'S intermedialism, which corresponds to the general idea of agnosticism, as well as pure theism and pure atheism. The pure theism is represented by the vertical imaginary axis, marked in yellow in the graph, indicated by the curved red arrow. In this case, the degree of religiosity is expressed by the complex number z, which is equal to only its imaginary part, IB. Although a person expressing such a view is convinced that God exists or a miracle has happened, the real value of the theistic view is zero. From the rational point of view, the zero real value of the imaginary being, or even refers to non-rational way of perceiving the real world through the thoughts going beyond the reality. Well, the human brain is real, but the thoughts generated in brain not always have to reflect the reality as exemplified by the purely theistic view presented in this chart. Whereas the pure atheism is represented by the horizontal real axis marked in green in the graph, indicated by the curved red arrow. So the degree of religiosity is expressed by the complex number z, which is equal to only its real part, A. In the case of pure atheism, person expressing such a view based on the rational argumentation ad rem is absolutely convinced that the God doesn't exist. Now let's consider intermedialism represented by the CANI'S complex plane. As seen in the graph, intermedialism approaches both the imaginary axis, representing pure theism, and the real axis of atheism, but never reach them. In other words, those two opposite views, theism and atheism, mark a borderline which intermedialism never reached them. Intermedialism corresponds to the degree of religiosity, which is the function of the complex number z, determined by the real number A and the imaginary number IB. In other words, intermedialism is the function of theism represented by the vertical imaginary axis IM and the atheism represented by the horizontal real axis, and it is contained in the right close interval both for imaginary and real values. In the polar system, intermedialism is represented by the angle alpha, which lies between the red arrow and the horizontal real axis, whereas the degree of religiosity is contained in the open interval of the angle alpha from 0 degree to 90 degrees. In concluding this lecture, let's answer the following questions. Does it make any sense to classify agnostics by categories 1 to 6? Do the categories made up by Dawkins reflect the nature of agnosticism? What are the pros and cons of agnosticism and intermedialism? And if you consider yourself a knowledgeable person, should you still identify yourself with agnosticism, intermedialism, theism, or atheism? Based on the previous considerations and also on my recent lecture on the fiction of agnosticism published on YouTube, it is apparent that considering yourself an agnostic, especially in one of the categories proposed by Dawkins, is not only ridiculous but downright senseless, regardless of the degree of religious agnosticism. An agnostic remains an agnostic, and it doesn't matter if an agnostic is closer to theism or atheism. But if we are going to picture agnosticism instead of its categorizing, there would be recommended to present agnosticism in its entire range without a specific classification of the degree of religiosity, but with an indication of the nature of religious agnosticism. Exactly this way, CANI'S intermedialism describes religious agnosticism. Following this idea, intermedialism pictures religious agnosticism as the complex plane formed from complex numbers z equals an plus IBN, where the square of the imaginary unit I equals -1. This complex plane of intermedialism is a part of the complex plane of religiosity and never reaches the borderline set by the imaginary vertical axis of pure theism and the real horizontal axis of pure atheism. However, the CANI'S complex plane of religiosity, including intermedialism, is more graphically complicated than the Dawkins linear scale of religiosity, including agnosticism, but it is much easier to apply and, most importantly, represents the religiosity from theism through intermedialism to atheism, just the way it is. Although intermedialism has the same meaning as the religious agnosticism, on the contrary to the agnosticism, does not hide the fact that it is senseless what agnostic, if knowledgeable, should be aware of to avoid ridicule. Despite this, intermedialism, like religious agnosticism, will always find acceptance, whether, for example, due to the lack of knowledge or social family conditions. Unfortunately, neither Huxley nor his followers mentioned these facts. Is it possible that Huxley and academics who share his agnostic view concerning religion intentionally ignore the scientific knowledge, declaring themselves religious agnostics only because to preserve the status quo concerning the natural view on the existence of God? After all, how can we accuse academics that their scientific knowledge, which as we know discredits the substantive value of religious agnosticism, wouldn't allow them to draw the conclusive conclusions from their considerations? Perhaps they advocate their religious agnosticism because they are more afraid of being pilloried as atheists who are acting against the religious dogma than of losing the prestige appropriate for a scientist. It looks that preserving status quo in matters of faith helps some way to maintain current professional and social position. Unfortunately, two-facedness is becoming more and more trendy, and admitting to atheism still exposes to less or more unpleasant consequences. Lies, ignorance and sharp practice dominates, and that's why we live in such a hypocritical world. We should also be aware of the fact that in some even democratic countries where dominates religion, when atheism is expressed in public, it happens to be equated with insulting religion and prosecuted by law. And this is the reality thanks to which the population of agnostics is growing year by year. Ultimately, it's up to you to decide which interpretation of religiosity you choose: Dawkins' scale of religiosity, including agnosticism, or the CANI'S complex plane of religiosity, including intermedialism. To learn more on intermedialism versus agnosticism, please listen to my lecture on YouTube, The Fiction of Agnosticism, Kania versus Huxley. If you represent a university or a scientific research institution and you are interested in my lecture, please feel free to contact me at theists.democracy@gmail.com. Sorry, this offer is not available to private individuals. Instead, everyone is invited to attend my seminars or to read my books. The point. Uncensored conversations. Delusion versus reality. Prior theory in applications. Plain va ban. Thank you for watching my presentation. I look forward to hearing from you. Goodbye.